Let's take a look at American Revolution and founding, which is certainly a big topic. Okay, so we got 5 questions here, and so these questions will show up again at the end of the video, and so that's a great time to see if you can remember some of the stuff that we go over in the video. So quickly going over these. What does no taxation without representation refer to? Who was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence? Um, the principal weakness of the Articles of Confederation. We want to know that. There was a compromise between two groups for the Bill of Rights. Do we know who those two groups were? And then finally, what amendment banned slavery? All right. So we start off with no taxation without representation. Very first bullet point. And see the very first bullet point? That's one of our questions, right? So no taxation without representation was a slogan used by American colonists in order to convey that many individuals residing in the 13 colonies believed that, as they were not directly represented in the distant British Parliament, any laws it passed affecting the colonists, such as the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, which we're going to go over here in a second, were illegal under the Bill of Rights of 1689 and were a denial of their rights as Englishmen. So no taxation without representation, very common, if not a direct question, at least shows up in a few multiple choice answers. Right, so we want to be familiar with that one. And then the Sugar Act was a revenue raising act passed by British Parliament in 1764. This increased the colonists' concerns about the intent of Parliament and continued the growth of what would become the American Revolution. Okay, so that's a very important one to know, the Sugar Act, followed by the Stamp Act, which would come a year later, 1765, and impose a direct tax on the colonies by imposing a stamp duty on newspapers and legal and commercial documents. So it was a direct tax. And then the Boston Massacre, that one occurred on March 5th, 1770. Shots fired by British soldiers in the streets of Boston on that day would spark the American Revolution. There were actually 2 battles of Saratoga, which were September 19th and October 7th, 1777. British General John Burgoyne was forced to surrender his entire army on October 17th. Many think this was the turning point of the war. Fort Sumter is in Charleston, South Carolina, and was the location of the first battle of the Civil War in 1861, so a little bit later. 2 really important people who are very likely to show up and you should be familiar with. Thomas Jefferson was an American founding father who was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, and he also later served as the 3rd president of the U.S. from 1801 to 1809. John Locke believed that people are born with certain natural rights, such as life, liberty, and property. Locke embodied the principles of enlightenment and was a clear influence on the founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence. Right, so there's a clear relationship to the writings of John Locke and what Thomas Jefferson put in to the Declaration of Independence. We want to be familiar with that connection. Okay, so here we have, right, we just titled it the Bill of Rights, but we want to go over the Articles of Confederation and the Bill of Rights. The Articles of Confederation was an agreement by all 13 states and served as the first Constitution in 1776. There was no president, no executive agencies, no judiciary, and no tax base. The new Constitution in 1789 would have a much stronger federal government with a president, courts, and taxes. The Articles of Confederation had a weak federal government. States printing their own currency interfered with interstate trade. Right? You could imagine if all 13 states had a different type of commerce, being able to trade across states was very difficult. Giving all the power to the states meant the federal government had no ability really to enforce any laws. That's another big one that you want to be familiar with about the Articles of Confederation, no federal taxes. And we also want to be familiar with the Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists believed that the Bill of Rights was necessary to protect people from a strong central government by specifically listing the rights of citizens. The Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution as a compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So I believe that fits in with one of our questions also. Right, so there on that third bullet point, you can see what was the principal weakness of the Articles of Confederation, which we just went over, right? Things like no taxes and interstate trade, those are things you want to be familiar with. The Bill of Rights, the fourth bullet point, was a compromise between whom? We want to just know that it's the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Okay, and then a few laws. Okay, so these are ones that really show up the most. Marbury v. Madison helped define the boundary between the executive and judicial branches of government and led to judicial review. So if you just know that sentence, that's enough for Marbury v. Madison, right? You know, you could write a whole essay on Marbury v. Madison, but right here we just want to know that it differentiated the executive and judicial branches and led to judicial review. The 10th Amendment expresses the principle of federalism by stating that the federal government possesses only those powers delegated to it by the U.S. Constitution. All remaining powers are reserved for the states or the people. The Homestead Act became law in 1862. The act provided 160 acres of unoccupied land to settlers if they improve the land and live there for 5 years. The Great Compromise of 1850 allowed for the creation of slave states and demanded that Northerners help in capturing fugitive slaves. Okay. So while it talks about the American Revolution and founding, you can see this section does kind of extend out, all the way into like the middle of the 19th century. Okay, Federalists versus Democrat Republicans. The Federalists had a loose interpretation of the Constitution, while Democrat Republicans favored a strict interpretation. This meant that the Federalists thought that if the Constitution did not rule out something, then it was okay, while the Democrat Republicans thought that if it was not in the Constitution, then it was not permitted by law. The Federalists favored a strong central government with the power to control commerce, tax, declare war, and make treaties. The Democrat Republicans sought to limit the role of the national government, favoring local control. The two groups had different views of the Constitution. The Federalists believed that the economy should be based on merchants and trade, while the Democrat Republicans believe it should be based on agriculture. The Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democrat Republicans by Thomas Jefferson. So that's interesting as you think about it even today, right? Some of those differences still show up between, they're now called different things, right? But between Republicans and Democrats. Okay, and then we have the Civil War amendments, which is the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments collectively are known as the Civil War Amendments, and they were designed to ensure equality for recently emancipated slaves. The 13th Amendment banned slavery and all involuntary servitude, except in the case of punishment for a crime. The 14th Amendment defined a citizen as any person born in or naturalized in the U.S., overturning the Dred Scott versus Sandford Supreme Court ruling in 1857, stating that black people were not eligible for citizenship. And the 15th Amendment prohibited governments from denying U.S. citizens the right to vote based on race, color, or past servitude. Okay, so each of those are different. So a lot of time that is a very common question, is which amendment banned slavery? And I believe that was even one of our questions, right? And so making sure that we know that's the 13th Amendment is the one that actually banned slavery. 14th Amendment focuses on citizenship. 15th Amendment focuses on voting for those of color. Okay, and then we jump back into our questions, right? So here are the 5 questions we saw at the beginning. You should be able to answer these questions now after having watched this video.